Pierre Poilievre's Trump-style rhetoric and economic agenda. A critical analysis, Pierre Poilievre at a rally brandishing Canada First slogans, a deliberate echo of Donald Trump's America First mantra. His nationalist, populist messaging has drawn strong parallels to Trump's tone and style. Trumpian tone, structure, and style in Poilievre's rhetoric. Pierre Poilievre's political communication often mirrors Donald Trump's combative populist style in both tone and structure. He has borrowed Trump's nationalist slogan, rebranding America First as Canada First, to rally supporters around a vision of sovereign self-interest, much like Trump's rallies. Poilievre's speeches are peppered with rhetorical questions and calls and responses. Who's ready to put Canada first for a change? That fire up crowds. He adopts a strongman persona, vowing personal protection of the nation. I will protect Canada, and I will always put our country first, he proclaims. A pledge couched in simple, forceful language, reminiscent of Trump's assertive promises. In tone, Poilievre channels Trump's pugnacity and anti-establishment anger. He habitually paints a dire picture of Canada's state, describing a country riddled with crime, drugs, and disastrous policies under his opponents. This dark portrayal of a nation in decline parallels Trump's American carnage narrative and serves to stoke public frustration. Likewise, Poilievre frequently casts political opponents as enemies of the people. He affixes derisive nicknames, e.g., calling NDP leader Jagmeet Singh Sellout Singh, and labels the Liberal government authoritarian socialists. Such name-calling and hyperbole strongly evoke Trump's habit of branding adversaries, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, and inflating threats for dramatic effect. Poilievre also targets institutional elites and media in Trumpian fashion. He accuses the press of unfair treatment and bias, echoing Trump's fake news refrains, his dismissal of questions about gender diversity, not aware of any other genders than man and woman. When asked if he'd mimic Trump's anti-trans policies, similarly mimics Trump's appeal to conservative social norms and rejection of progressive discourse. Analysts note that Poilievre has very consciously presented himself as a Trumpian figure, cultivating an image of a populist outsider despite his long career in politics. The overall argumentative style, blame gatekeepers, promise to take back control, and speak directly to a forgotten working class, closely mirrors the Trump playbook, even as Poilievre tries to Canadianize it. Poilievre employs this Trump-like rhetoric to justify his economic and trade policy stances, framing them as battles for ordinary Canadians against predatory outsiders or inept elites. For instance, in responding to U.S. tariff threats, Poilievre strikes a defiant tone. If a foreign government attacks Canadian industry, we have to retaliate, he insisted, defending his promise of tit-for-tat tariffs. This mirrors Trump's own tariff rhetoric, portraying trade as warfare, and presents retaliatory tariffs as a patriotic necessity rather than a tax on consumers. Poilievre has lambasted President Trump's tariff onslaught as an outright betrayal, stating that Trump chosen to betray America's best friend and closest ally, Canada. Yet in the same breath, Poilievre pivots to blame Canadian liberals for making us so dependent on the Americans in trade. This clever argumentative shift channels nationalist resentment, akin to Trump's bad deals rhetoric, to argue that Canada must renegotiate its trade agreements. He vowed that on day one as Prime Minister, he'd call Washington and demand a rapid renegotiation of NAFTA's successor, CUSMA, on Canada's terms, the muscular, deal-making posture, essentially attempting to redo a major trade pact by sheer force of will, is straight out of Trump's art of the deal style, even if experts warn such a move under the current U.S. administration could backfire when it comes to military commitments and national defense. Poilievre's rhetoric similarly emphasizes toughness and sovereignty. He echoes Trump's push for allies to spend more on defense, but pointedly asserts that Canada will make our own decisions on military spending. He rails against liberal weakness on defense, claiming Trudeau starved the armed forces, a refrain parallel to Trump's critique of prior U.S. leaders. and pledges to rebuild our military to stand up for Canada. Notably, Poilievre has wrapped himself in patriotism when discussing NATO and NORAD, promising to bear any burden and pay any price to protect the sovereignty and independence of our country. That soaring line, borrowed from JFK but deployed in a Trumpian context, was meant to signal a hardline stance, that under Poilievre, Canada would invest whatever is needed in its defenses rather than rely on an unreliable U.S. partner. The tone is resolute and uncompromising, portraying policies like increased defense spending or Arctic security buildup as common-sense self-preservation in an era of American treachery. This nationalist framing provides political cover for what might otherwise be contentious expenditures by casting them as essential to protect Canada first. Poilievre's criticisms of Mark Carney are also delivered with a Trump-like populist sneer. Carney, a former central banker now leading the Liberals, is subtly caricatured by Poilievre as an out-of-touch elitist and globalist. On the campaign trail, Poilievre has worked to attach Carney to the so-called lost decade of liberal rule, even though Carney only recently entered politics. This distortion, blaming Carney for Trudeau-era economic shortcomings, reflects an argumentative style long used by Trump. Tether your opponent to all establishment failures in voters' minds. As the race tightened, Poilievre and his allies escalated to outright character attacks. In what analysts called the Conservatives' last gambit, smear Carney, Poilievre, with former PM Stephen Harper's help, launched highly personal broadsides, questioning Carney's integrity and allegiance. The insinuations and innuendo in this smear campaign, amplified on social media and friendly outlets, are textbook Trumpian tactics, diverting from policy debate to discredit an opponent's character. By demonizing Carney as a purported elitist villain, Poilievre seeks to justify his own platform as the antidote to Carney's supposed elite agenda. It's a rhetorical move to convince voters that supporting Poilievre's policies, however radical, is preferable to trusting a banker who sold out, language Poilievre's camp has flirted with. This approach, however, has drawn criticism for its factual shakiness and American-style divisiveness. Canada First economics, resource reliance versus sustainable growth. Central to Poilievre's platform is an oil and gas-centric economic vision, which he defends with the same Trump-esque populism. He portrays Canada's fossil fuel sector as the prime engine of jobs and prosperity, vowing to unleash Canadian resources and fast-track pipelines, mines, and energy infrastructure as the core of his growth plan. In stump speeches, he often claims that removing environmental gatekeepers and carbon taxes will kickstart the economy for the working class, implicitly arguing that resource extraction is Canada's ticket to greatness, much as Trump touted coal and oil resurgence for America. However, a look at the data suggests Poilievre overstates the economic impact of oil and gas. In reality, the entire oil and natural gas industry accounted for only about 3.2% of Canada's GDP in 2022. Even broad measures counting indirect spin-offs put it under 7% of GDP. The sector represents a modest share of Canadian employment as well. By comparison, sectors like manufacturing, services, and tech each rival or exceed that contribution. Relying on a commodity-centric strategy thus carries risks. Global oil prices are volatile, and the world's pivot toward clean energy threatens to erode fossil fuel demand in the long run. Critics note that Poilievre's promise to approve at least 10 natural resource projects immediately and scrap emissions caps caters to short-term interests of oil executives while ignoring these structural realities. Economists and policy analysts caution that Poilievre's focus on extraction over value-added or innovation-driven growth could leave Canada lagging. Mark Carney and others have argued that Canada must fundamentally reimagine our economy in a changing world, investing in technology, clean industries, and higher-value manufacturing, rather than doubling down on raw resource exports. Yet Poilievre's platform devotes comparatively little emphasis to innovation. Beyond a tax break for reinvesting capital gains, which he dubiously calls rocket fuel for growth, his economic plan leans on deregulation and tax cuts as cure-alls. This is in line with decades-old conservative orthodoxy, but it neglects the fact that productivity and prosperity in modern economies are often driven by education, R&D, and diversification, not simply by cutting red tape. Poilievre's own rhetoric suggests a near dismissal of high-tech and green industries. He derides clean energy investments and instead champions oil pipelines as job creators. The danger of this one-dimensional approach is that it may fail to foster a resilient, future-ready economy. For example, while Poilievre blames carbon pricing for hurting consumers, he ignores that the tax rebates leave most households better off, and that oil companies reaped record profits during recent inflationary spikes. Abolishing climate measures, as he proposes, might boost oil output, but at the cost of trade frictions, e.g., EU carbon tariffs, and environmental damage down the road. Independent analyses, including in the Tyee and by progressive economists, have been skeptical of Poilievre's resource-heavy economic claims. They point out that Canada's growth challenges, from sluggish productivity to a lack of industrial strategy, won't be solved by drill, baby, drill. One commentator wryly observed that, "Don't let the rhetoric fool you. Poilievre represents more of the same trickle-down playbook, not a genuine populist overhaul." In fact, Poilievre's heavy emphasis on oil and gas may overlook more sustainable paths to prosperity. Value-added sectors, like processing our minerals into batteries or using our skilled workforce to grow tech startups, can create higher-paying jobs and more stable growth than simply exporting raw bitumen or logs. Poilievre rarely champions such sectors with the fervor he reserves for pipelines. This imbalance suggests an economic vision overly anchored in the 20th century resource economy, at the expense of the innovation-driven economy of the 21st century. Title conclusion. Pierre Poilievre's rhetoric undeniably channels the populist energy of Donald Trump, employing similar techniques of scapegoating, strongman posturing, and nationalist sloganeering to connect with frustrated voters. This Trumpian style has been a double-edged sword. It galvanized a base hungry for Canada First bravado, but it also raised concerns among many Canadians wary of Trump-style politics crossing the 49th parallel. Poilievre's interview remarks and campaign messaging about Trump reveal a politician trying to balance on a Trumpian tightrope, echoing the former U.S. president's rhetoric, even as he belatedly distances himself from Trump's most extreme actions. When justifying policies on trade, defense, and the economy, Poilievre wraps his arguments in that same combative populism. Tariffs become a stand for national pride, resource expansion becomes a crusade for the working class, and even attacks on an opponent like Carney become about defending the people from elitist schemes. Ultimately, the validity of Poilievre's claims has been strongly challenged by experts and journalists. Outlets like the Tyee have noted that his Trump-like narratives often gloss over inconvenient facts, be it the relatively small footprint of oil and gas in the overall economy, or the potential fallout of a trade war. He says he can easily fix. While Poilievre's rhetorical techniques, simple repeated phrases, us versus them framing, blame-laden stories, are effective at rallying anger, they do not automatically translate into effective governance or economic success. The contrast between Poilievre's bombast and Mark Carney's technocratic approach in this election has been stark. Carney offers bland competence as an antidote to Trumpian chaos, whereas Poilievre leans into performative outrage as a vehicle for his platform. Whether Canadians ultimately buy into Poilievre's Trump-style pitch or prefer a more fact-driven vision remains to be seen. What is clear, however, is that Poilievre's campaign has imported both the style and substance of Trumpist politics, and with it, the same questions about truth, economic populism, and national identity that Americans have wrestled with.